Welcome to the HTLL podcast. We are your co-hosts, Tino Movuti, Technical Advisor for WASH,
and Emily Hirata, Technical Advisor for Health and Nutrition.
In today's episode, we will explore the emotional toll of humanitarian work and what it takes to build resilience in the face of burnout, moral injury, compassion fatigue, survivor's guilt, and other mental health challenges that too often go unnamed. Whether you've been in the field for years or just starting out, chances are you or someone you've worked closely with has felt the weight of this work. So today, we're diving into what it means to care for ourselves and each other, and what you and organizations like ADRA can do to better support the mental well-being of their teams. We're joined by Weanne Estrada-Magbanua, a mental health specialist at ADRA International, who brings deep experience in supporting staff mental health and organizational wellness in crisis-affected settings. Together, we'll unpack the risks, the stigma, and the strategies that help us thrive, not just survive, in the work that we do. Weanne, it's great to have you with us on our podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is my first podcast to be in, so exciting times for sure.
Weanne, let's begin with the big picture. What are some of the unique mental health challenges that humanitarian workers face, whether that's in protracted or high-stress environments or in offices that support frontline staff?
Yeah, sure. Humanitarian staff, they carry essentially two layers of stress, right? The first is the actual trauma and the crisis that they're responding to. And even if they're not the direct victims, they're still exposed to other people's suffering day in and day out. And that's what we call vicarious trauma. That's what happens when you absorb the pain of others. Let's say you're a caseworker and you're listening to the stories of refugees every day, or maybe you're an emergency responder and you're walking through a village destroyed by a disaster. They say that, watching suffering and loss and not being touched by it is as unrealistic as walking through water without getting wet. And that's exactly what the humanitarian experience is. And then on top of that, you have what is called moral injury. And you alluded to this, Tino, in your introduction. It's the guilt that comes when you have to make decisions that cut against your own values. So imagine a pregnant mother comes at your distribution site after all your supplies have run out, and you have no choice but to turn her away, even though you know that there'll be severe consequences on her family and her child. Or think about when organizations have to evacuate and leave their communities behind because of security risks or funding cuts. They do that knowing that they're leaving entire communities behind without critical access to services. We see this a lot, especially now from doctors returning from Gaza, right? So physicians have spoken out about the guilt of not being able to leave while their Gazan colleagues and their patients that they cared for are not able to. And so this type of knowledge and experience doesn't leave you quickly. And it's not only the frontline staff. So even those in headquarters, those in support roles, they can still feel this urgency and the guilt, even if they're thousands of miles away. In fact, the distance can maybe make it worse for them. They feel safe while their colleagues are under fire or under displacement, and that creates its own kind of helplessness as well. And so that's the first layer of stress. There's this second layer of stress that comes from the nature of humanitarian work itself. So you're working long hours, you have disrupted sleep, you're skipping meals, you're living in tough living conditions, you're far away from your family and usual support systems. So overall, these two layers, they total to what we call cumulative stress. So it's not just one event that affects humanitarians, it's the steady drip of stress, especially in protracted situations where you start feeling that maybe the system is broken, there's no end in sight, and what you're doing is just a band-aid. So over time, that weight can lead to burnout. It changes the way people see their work and even how they treat colleagues or the communities they've served. So maybe if you've ever wondered why humanitarians, sometimes they make dark jokes or they seem cynical, that's not indifference on their part. That's just the residue of the moral injury and the exhaustion that they've been carrying too long. And we see this in the evidence that exposure to these things, it really raises the risks of burnout, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder in humanitarians. 1 in 3 humanitarian workers meet the criteria for one of these conditions, and that is so much higher than the general population. But, and I'm sorry that this has become a long answer, but don't want to end with that sad fact. I do want to mention something that even though the risk for these conditions are high among humanitarians, studies have also shown that humanitarians are also remarkably resilient. And this might just be because, working in this field forces you to be resilient. Or it could just be that the people who come into this line of work are those that are naturally resilient in the first place, or come into this work because this type of work, gives them fulfillment and they thrive under the pressure. So, well, yes, the humanitarians, they face extraordinary pressure, but, they also show extraordinary resilience. And both of those realities exist side by side.
That is a lot of information to unpack that you just shared with us. I'm sure many of our listeners might be able to relate to some of the challenges that you've mentioned. I know I can relate. Yet, despite the prevalence and these very unique challenges, many of us still struggle to talk about mental health, especially in faith-based or multicultural teams. What are some barriers that keep humanitarian workers such as ourselves from actually seeking help?
Yeah, so there was this one study that actually looked into this because it is a real issue. It looked at why humanitarian workers struggle with help seeking. So they interviewed about 14 humanitarian workers, and they found that help seeking for mental health has two sides. So first is the actual attitude. How do people think about mental health and whether it feels acceptable to get help? And then the other side is behavior, whether people actually have the skills or the language to ask for it. So let's go to the attitudinal side. So the study found that in the humanitarian world, there is what they call a martyr culture, or interestingly enough, some of the people who were interviewed mentioned the term aid cowboy. So imagine a lone ranger, riding into crisis after crisis, sleeping on the floor, eating whatever scraps are available, boasting about pulling 16-hour days in the middle of a disaster zone. That aid cowboy, that's the perception of what a humanitarian worker should be, right? Someone who sacrifices their own well-being for the greater good of the work. So in this culture, admitting that you're struggling, it feels like disqualification. Staff members are scared to admit that they're anxious because, what if they're never sent to the field again? And then people at headquarters, they often think, oh, I can't complain. The staff in the field have it worse. And then the staff on the field, they think, oh, I can't complain. The community has it worse. And so this hierarchy of suffering, it just keeps everyone quiet. And we see very similar patterns in other high-stress professions. So for example, a study of firefighters who responded to 9/11, it found that those at the very top, so the big bosses, and those at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the new hires, the junior hires, they were both the least likely to seek help. So senior staff feared that they'd lose credibility, while the junior staff worried that they'd lose their chance to advance. And this is the same thing in the humanitarian culture at both ends of the spectrum. People feel that asking for help means losing something, whether that's, control, respect, or career advancement. And faith also adds another dimension. You mentioned faith. In some faith-based settings, prayer, scripture, they're seen as the only acceptable coping tools. And so workers worry that acknowledging distress will be judged as a lack of faith. It's like, if you're praying enough, then you shouldn't be struggling. So that's the attitudinal side. And then there's the behavioral side. Maybe someone does want help. They just don't know how to ask for it. Maybe they've never seen it modeled. Maybe they don't know what services exist. In some cultures, the very language of mental health is in itself a barrier. So maybe they don't have, in their language, they don't have words for mental health. Maybe their word for mental illness is the same word as crazy. So people end up avoiding the topic altogether. So, yes, there's barriers about stigma, but there's also cultural, spiritual, organizational, and even linguistic barriers to help seeking for mental health.
That's really interesting. With these barriers in mind, have you seen any progress or any patterns in how organizations or leaders are beginning to address this? Are there any examples you know of what a more supportive work culture might look like to actually help improve these health seeking attitudes and behaviors?
hmm So, over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, thankfully, we've seen real shifts. More organizations, more agencies are recognizing that staff care isn't, a luxury. It's actually critical to the mission. And I think that this is driven by two things. So, one, I think this is driven by the evidence. We've just seen more studies come out in recent years that show clear links between managerial support, organizational support, and staff well-being. And then the second part, I think, is just generational. It's just that the newer wave of humanitarians, they've grown up with more mental health language and less stigma around self-care. We see this a lot in Gen Z, right? And I'm so proud of them. They're more likely to prioritize balance, whereas the older aid cowboy identity, which is working until you collapse, that was more common among previous generations. So increasingly, it's becoming less about, the lone cowboy who sprints from crisis to crisis. And it's more about the marathon runner who, maybe paces themselves, takes water breaks, and focuses on finishing strong so that they don't collapse before the finish line. But that being said, those in leadership, so the managers, the team leaders, they're still coming most often from the older generations. So they're still more likely to retain the more traditional views of coping, which unfortunately still keeps some of the stigma alive. So that's still something that needs to change. And then to the question of what a supportive work culture looks like, I would say it's systemic. It's from top to bottom. It's not necessarily some big mental health event or like a webinar that an organization puts on once a year, right? I would say a supportive work culture is when mental health care is just so ingrained that the actions feel natural and not formal at all. And to me, it looks like, a leader saying openly in a staff meeting, hey, last week's incident really shook me up. So I spoke to the staff counselor about it. Saying that makes everyone else feel that it's safe to do the same. It's the leader modeling that they log off on time. So for me, if I see my leaders, my managers, my supervisors, my admin, modeling these things, it makes me feel better about having those own boundaries for myself. It's making sure that staff rotate out of the field for breaks before burnout sets in. It's a team holding a short debrief at the end of the day so that no one carries the weight alone. It's the check-ins that are so natural from staff to staff member, where they just say, hey, how are you doing? How did you sleep last night? While they're all having lunch together. It's having clear referral pathways and counseling support that is free and confidential, and having training and for managers so that they can spot the red flags and respond well. So it's these small, consistent action that I would say really shows what a supportive work culture would look like and would be the ideal.
Now let's talk, Weanne, about what we can do at an individual level. What are some of the practical, evidence-based strategies that individual staff can use to take care of their mental health in high-stress contexts? And what can the agencies and organizations that we work for do to support staff mental health resilience?
So that's a good question. So maybe let's start with the individuals. There really isn't one, magical, innovative strategy for mental health and humanitarian work that people haven't heard of before. Most of the evidence-based practices we recommend are actually very simple that they might feel trivial to some. But those small habits are what I like to call load bearers. And I recently learned about the concept of load bearing walls when we moved to a new house. And I found out that, oh, yes, some walls you can remove for renovation purposes, but there are just some walls that you can't remove because they hold up the weight of the house. And so, how does that translate to mental health? Well, think of a time in life when things were maybe going well and everything felt manageable, and then one small change threw everything off. So maybe your commute changed and You lost the 5-minute walk that gave you fresh air at the end of the day. Or maybe the 7-Eleven at the corner of your street that you go to for late groceries closed, so then meals became harder. So suddenly, you're thriving less in ways that you didn't expect. And that's what load bearers are. They're that 5-minute walk, that late night grocery store. You don't really notice them, but they're part of your mental architecture. They hold up your well being. And while you might not feel any difference when you do them, you will feel the difference when you don't. And so, when we talk about self care in high stress humanitarian contexts, the key is about identifying and protecting your load bearing practices. So I can just share a few. This can be things like micro recovery. So those are the short resets that you have throughout the day. Maybe taking a few minutes to do some deep breathing before an aid distribution. Maybe that's stepping outside to look at the sky in between meetings, or maybe that's stretching before bed. Another thing is peer connection. Studies are very consistent. They show that social support is the strongest buffer against burnout. So that means, intentionally checking in with a colleague or choosing to share a meal with them instead of eating alone. And then the third is boundaries. In humanitarian work, the lines between life and work blur very easily, but we found that people who intentionally set boundaries, so maybe no emails after 9 p.m. or a morning walk before opening WhatsApp or saying no to certain tasks, people who do that, they are more resilient over time. And then finally, physical basics, those matter more than we admit. So regular sleep, hydration, physical activity, they're really some of the best evidence-based protectors against stress, but they're usually the first we let go of in an emergency. So even simple choices like carrying a water bottle with you when you do your work, that can dramatically reduce the impact of stress on your body. So these are just the small things that individuals can do for their mental health. When it comes to organizations, when I think of this, I think that an ideal organization is one where the onus isn't on staff to ask for support, and the responsibility is on the organization to build it in from the start. So I want to use the example of ADRA because we've been doing that by weaving in mental health and psychosocial support into every phase of deployment in the staff members that we deploy. So before deployment, during deployment, and after deployment. So before we deploy staff, we ask them to complete self-assessments for mental and physical readiness. We run orientation so that they know what to expect in the field and what mental health supports are available. We also tell each staff member that they can access pre-deployment counseling sessions with an external counselor so that they can learn about strategies to protect themselves in advance. And then we also ask staff members to make a personal self-care plan before they go into the field. So we ask them to list daily practices, the people they'll reach out to if they're struggling, and the words that they'll say to themselves when things get tough. So we ask them to do all that before deployment. And then during deployment, the support continues. Managers are trained to do regular check-ins and to recognize the signs of elevated stress in their teams. And then we also train staff so that they can provide psychological first aid to each other. And then at any point in this, staff can still access free confidential counseling. And then after deployment, recovery is intentional. Staff are given time off. They have a post-deployment guide to help them adjust back to, regular life. They're given a formal assessment for burnout, empathy fatigue, or vicarious trauma, and they still have access to a counselor for proper psychological debriefing. So all this to say, a good organization is an organization where staff don't have to wonder whether they're allowed to ask for help. It's just an organization that builds those systems in already so that care becomes the default.
I'm really learning so much from this conversation, Weanne. And as you were speaking, I took notes of some of those tips that you gave. And for sure, I'm going to have those tips on a little sticky note in my cubicle to remind me of the things that I can do at a personal level. You already touched briefly about the role of faith, but I'd like to circle back to that. Many people tend to turn to their faith during difficulties that have the potential to deeply impact mental health. And often people of faith may encourage those around them, such as other colleagues, to pray or conduct some other act of faith to get through challenging times. And while those people might be well-meaning, these types of recommendations can sometimes seem unhelpful and even harmful and dismissive of the gravity of the difficult challenge at hand, especially when prayer and other acts of faith have already been taking place. How can we encourage humanitarians, particularly those that work for faith-based NGOs like ADRA, to not neglect utilizing and encouraging the evidence-based strategies that you just described, when it often may feel natural to simply turn to acts of faith like prayer and scripture reading alone?
That's a great question, Tino, and it's very, very relevant. So I first want to say that faith is really one of the most powerful resilience tools that we have, and studies have shown this. Prayer, scripture, worship, they all provide hope, meaning, and community in the middle of chaos. But the risk is just when faith is used as a replacement for evidence-based strategies rather than a complement. So this is where well-intentioned advice, and maybe we've heard this in our daily lives. It's when advice like just pray harder, that advice can feel dismissive, especially if you're someone who has already been praying, but you're still struggling. So for things like this, I like to encourage what is called both/and approach. So quote both/and unquote approach. So, if someone comes to you and opens up about their mental health, yes, pray together, absolutely. But also normalize asking, and would you like to talk to a counselor about this? ADRA offers free confidential counseling, right? Or, yes, you can pray together with your team at the end of the day, and then you can do a quick breathing exercise afterwards to ground yourselves. You can open a team meeting with scripture and then go around the table asking, so what's one thing you're doing this week to manage stress? Let's all share. Pray with each other after a critical incident and then walk together for 10 minutes as a way of decompressing. So I think just making sure to utilize, prayer, scripture, and worship with all these more practical strategies so that they'll really complement each other. And again, this is not to say that prayer, scripture, and worship are not evidence-based, because evidence has shown that they are powerful tools for resilience, but really just making sure that you don't neglect one, at the expense of the other.
I totally agree with all that you said. And of course, we too deeply believe in the power of prayer to carry us through challenging times. At the same time, like you mentioned already, I think it's important to understand that there are moments when additional support, like professional mental health care or some of the other strategies that you mentioned, can be part of how God can work to bring healing. As we round off this amazing conversation, what message would you want frontline staff, advisors, or leaders to take away from this conversation?
So if I could leave one message, it would be this. So maybe let's start with the leaders. Leaders out there, if you're hearing me, this is what I want to say to you. All the research and all the organizations that specialize in wellness, they all say the same thing. And that is destigmatizing mental health in the workplace. It really starts at the top. So if the leaders model it, if they speak openly about it, your team will know that it's safe for them to do the same. So please take this responsibility seriously, because the culture shift really, really, starts with them. And then for staff, I want to say, I like using this metaphor, and that is to put on your own oxygen mask first, right? On planes, we're told to put our own mask on first before helping others. And that's because you can't save anyone if you're running out of oxygen yourself. And so the same is true in humanitarian work. Our ability to serve others calmly, effectively, and sustainably, it all depends on our own ability to function in a relative state of calm. And even Jesus recognized this need, right? In Mark 6:31, after all the disciples had been serving tirelessly, he told them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So the crowds were pressing in, the needs were everywhere, but Jesus still reminded his followers that rest was essential to sustaining this mission. So if it was true for them, then it's still true for us these days. So that's the message that I would want humanitarians to take away from this conversation.
Weanne, this has been an amazing conversation, one of the best that I've had, and I've learned so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights into the emotional realities of humanitarian work and the practical ways we can care for ourselves and our teams have been incredibly valuable. Thank you so much once again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun. It's my pleasure. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, so thank you for the opportunity.
I just want to echo Tino's words of thanks. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This was very insightful for me as well. To our listeners, if you would like to hear more career reflections from practitioners in health, nutrition, and WASH, or if you would like to learn about other topics regarding health, nutrition, and WASH, such as what we heard today, feel free to contact the Health Technical Learning Lab at healthtll@adra.org. That's healthtll@adra.org. To listen to other episodes of the HTLL podcast, please find us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. We also now have a Spanish channel for HTLL episodes in Spanish. To check this out, search the HTLL podcast -Español. Thanks for listening and join us next time for another episode of the HTLL podcast.